I spent years learning how to carry a heart that had been bruised by distance, silence, and time. I stood in the ruins of my own life and wondered if I would ever feel whole again. But somewhere between the breaking and the rebuilding, I found the woman I was meant to become. My name is Evelyn, and at 65, I have learned that the heart does not age the way the body does, because every year I find myself carrying the same longing, the same hope, and the same quiet ache that has lived inside me since the day my children grew up and drifted into lives that no longer touched each other the way they once did. And as I sit here, remembering the early mornings when their small voices filled my home with laughter, I feel a pull inside me that refuses to fade, no matter how many seasons pass. A pull that tells me that the love between them is worth fighting for, even if they no longer realize how deeply they still need one another. And every time my birthday approaches, I begin preparing long before the date itself, because I know that gathering them in one room is not just a celebration for me, but a chance to bring them closer, even for a moment. So I open the old wooden boxes I have kept safely hidden in a corner of my closet, and I take out the small memories that once defined their world together. The tiny toy car with chipped paint that they argued over. The faded photograph of all three of them making silly faces in the backyard. The crumpled drawings that once hung proudly on the refrigerator. And the letters they wrote to me when they were little, with misspelled words and uneven lines that somehow carried more sincerity than anything I ever read again. And as I touch each item, I feel the warmth of their childhood rising in me like a living heartbeat, reminding me of the days when my home was bursting with noise and chaos and love, when arguments ended in laughter and hugs, when bedtime stories stretched into endless conversations about their dreams, and when the world felt small enough for all of them to fit inside my arms without even trying. And although life has carried them in different directions and given them responsibilities that keep them busy from dawn until nightfall, I still believe with everything inside me that the roots we grow together cannot disappear simply because time moves forward. And this belief is what leads me to set the table every year with the same care I used when they were children, folding napkins the way they used to like, cooking dishes that carry the scent of their childhood, lighting candles that cast a soft glow against the walls, because I want the room to feel warm and familiar the moment they step inside. And while I work, I talk to myself quietly, telling myself that this year will be different, that this year they will look at one another and see the same connection they once shared. And even though a part of me fears disappointment, I still move forward with the kind of hope only a mother can hold, the kind that survives everything, even loneliness. And when the door finally opens and they walk in with their tired smiles and polite greetings, I feel something inside me soften, because no matter how distant they have become, the moment they step into this house, they are still the same children I once rocked to sleep. And when I hand them each a small item from the memory box, I watch their expressions slowly change as recognition flickers in their eyes. And I see their shoulders drop and their voices soften, as if the weight of the world lifts for just a second. And in that second, I witness something sacred, something I have waited for all year. Because memories have a way of reaching places that words cannot, pulling at the pieces of the heart that adulthood tries to harden. And as they begin sharing stories they had forgotten and laughing at moments they had not thought about in decades, I feel myself breathe in a way I have not breathed all year long, with relief, with gratitude, with the quiet knowledge that even if the world outside has changed, the bond they share is not lost. It is only asleep. And seeing them awaken it together fills me with a joy so deep I cannot place it into simple language, because it feels like watching the sunrise after months of darkness, slow and steady and unbearably beautiful. And while they promise me they will stay connected and visit each other more often, I hold those words gently in my heart, knowing that life does not always allow such vows to remain unbroken. Yet even if they forget a little and drift again, I know they will always find their way back to each other when given the chance, because what they share was born long before they understood its value. And as the night grows quiet and they hug me goodbye, I whisper to myself that I am not alone, not truly, because the love they carry for each other and for me is alive even in their absence. And though the house grows still again after they leave, I sit for a while in the warm glow of the moment, feeling the kind of peace that only a mother can understand. A peace that tells me that love is not measured by distance or frequency, but by the memories that keep us connected, no matter how wide the world becomes. And this belief stays with me long after I blow out the candles, because it reminds me that my purpose has never been to hold them close, but to help them hold each other. And in that purpose, I find a strength that guides me through every quiet night. I woke the next morning with the faint aroma of last night's candles still lingering in the air, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to lie there with my eyes closed, letting the memory of my children's laughter fill the quiet corners of my mind. Because the house always feels different the day after they leave, softer in some places and heavier in others. And as I slowly sat up, I felt the familiar blend of gratitude and longing settle inside my chest. A mixture I have learned to live with, even though it never truly becomes easy. And while the sunlight pushed gently through the curtains, I found myself replaying the small details of the night before. The way my oldest absent-mindedly straightened the pictures on the wall, the way he used to when he was little, the way my daughter rested her head on her brother's shoulder, just as she did during thunderstorms, the way my youngest laughed the same bright laugh he had when he was 5. And these quiet recollections warmed me enough to rise from the bed and walk through the house, touching the chairs they sat on and the glasses they used, letting my fingers rest for a moment on the table, where they leaned toward one another with the kind of closeness they had not shown in years. And as I stood there, I felt a sense of purpose glowing inside me, as if life were whispering that love leaves traces even after it moves out of the room. Traces you can feel if you pay attention. And that thought carried me to the kitchen, where I poured myself a cup of coffee and let the steam rise against my face while the morning settled around me. And I found myself thinking about the choices that shape us and the moments that define our family, the quiet ones especially, the ones without celebration or ceremony, the ones that happen when no one realizes how important they are. And it made me think about how often we rush through life, forgetting that connection needs attention, the same way a plant needs water. Not constantly, but consistently, enough to remind it that it is meant to grow. And as I walked to the living room, I noticed the small toy car still sitting on the shelf where one of my children had placed it after holding it with a tenderness I had not seen in years. And I realized how strange it is that something so small can carry so much history, can hold the power to soften grown adults into who they once were. And the thought made me smile in a way that reached deeper than the surface, because it reminded me that the past is never really gone. It simply waits for moments like these to return with a quiet grace that can heal more than words ever could. And as I sat in my favorite chair, I wrapped my hands around my warm cup and let myself breathe slowly while I watched the light move across the room. And I reflected on how motherhood changes with time, how it shifts from tying shoelaces and packing lunches to watching from a distance while your children build lives that feel both close and far at the same time. And yet, through all of it, you remain connected to them in a way that does not depend on proximity, but on something deeper, something sacred, something formed long before any of you understood its meaning. And as I traced the rim of my cup, I felt the ache of missing them and the comfort of loving them all at once, because this is what it means to be a mother at my age, to hold memories in one hand and hope in the other, balancing them gently as you walk through the quiet hours of the day. And while the house around me settled back into stillness, I found myself thinking about how each of my children carries a different piece of me, how they each reflect a part of my life that has shaped who I am. And I wondered if they know how much of their childhood I still carry with me. How every small object tucked into those old boxes is more than a keepsake. It is a reminder of a time when they needed me in every way, and when I believed the world would always feel full and warm and within reach. And even though that time has passed, I am learning that love is not something that fades with change. It adapts, it stretches, it finds new ways to exist. And when I stood up and walked to the hallway mirror, I saw my reflection and the years etched softly around my eyes. And instead of feeling older, I felt grateful because each line carries its own story, each moment of joy and worry and learning forming a map of my life. And I whispered to myself that this chapter is not one of emptiness, but of quiet understanding. A chapter where connection is built through effort rather than routine, where love is maintained not by daily presence, but by intentional moments that bring us back to one another. And as I stepped away from the mirror, I knew that I would continue to create these moments every year, because even if my children do not fully realize the impact now, they will someday. And when that day comes, they will understand that the memories I saved were never about nostalgia alone. They were about giving them something to return to when life becomes too loud, a place where they can remember who they are and who they have always been to. And with that thought, I opened the windows to let the morning breeze in, feeling the air move gently through the room, like a quiet reminder that everything changes, yet everything essential remains. When the afternoon settled in and the light stretched softly across the living room floor, I found myself drawn back to the old wooden boxes that held the pieces of my children's early years. And even though I had gone through them the day before, something inside me wanted to sit with them again, as if the memories themselves were asking for my attention. So I eased myself onto the floor and opened the first box, feeling the familiar mix of tenderness and ache rise through me as I lifted the lid. And the moment the scent of old paper and worn fabric reached me, I felt time folding in on itself, bringing me back to nights when my children fell asleep curled beside me, and mornings when their footsteps echoed through the hallway, like a promise that the day would be filled with life. And as I sifted through the letters and tiny treasures, I allowed myself to linger on each object, the way you linger on a photograph of someone you love, not because you need to, but because it feels right, almost necessary. And I picked up a small stuffed animal with one ear slightly bent and held it against my chest, remembering how my daughter used to drag it everywhere she went until the fur became thin and the seams grew tired. And the thought made me smile, with a kind of softness that comes only from knowing you witnessed someone you love grow into themselves. And then I reached for a crayon drawing my youngest had made of all of us standing in the backyard, our faces round and imperfect and full of joy. And I let my fingers trace the uneven lines while I pictured his small hands gripping the crayons so tightly that they sometimes snapped in half, a habit he never outgrew until the world asked him to hold more serious things. And I could almost hear the laughter that once filled the house as my children chased each other through the rooms, leaving behind small footprints that I did not always have the energy to clean, but always had the heart to cherish. And as I set the drawing aside, I felt a quiet wave of gratitude wash over me, because not every mother gets to hold physical pieces of her children's childhood so closely. And I knew that each item in these boxes carried a story, a moment frozen in time, a reminder of the love we built together before life pulled them into different directions. And while I leaned back against the couch, I let myself reflect on how quickly everything had changed. How one moment I was tying shoelaces and cutting crusts off sandwiches, and the next moment I was watching them leave home with nervous excitement, promising to visit often, as if promises themselves could stop the world from turning. And even though their visits became shorter and their conversations more hurried, I never blamed them, because I understood that growing up means learning to move forward. And I also understood that my role had shifted from being the center of their world to being the place they returned to when the world became too heavy. And that realization did not make me sad the way I once feared it would. Instead, it made me feel steady and proud. Because love does not vanish when its shape changes. It simply settles into a new form that carries its own quiet strength. And as I placed the contents of the box neatly back inside, I thought about the ways in which I have adapted over the years, learning to give them space without letting go, learning to stay close without holding tight, learning to accept that distance does not erase connection, and that silence does not mean forgetfulness. And as these thoughts moved through me, I felt something inside me shift slightly, a gentle reminder that motherhood is not a single chapter, but a lifelong story that continues to grow, even when the pages seem blank. And I stood up slowly, letting my hands brush against the fabric of the couch for balance, and walked toward the window where the sunlight painted the walls in soft gold. And as I watched the trees sway outside, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth I rarely speak aloud, that there are days when the quiet of this house feels larger than I want it to be. Days when I miss the noise and the clutter and the constant motion of raising children. Days when I wish I could step back into even one of those afternoons when we all sat together on the floor surrounded by crayons and toys, and the kind of peace that comes only when you do not yet understand how precious time is. And admitting this to myself did not feel like a weakness. It felt like an honesty I deserved, because loving someone deeply means allowing yourself to miss them without apology. And as I closed the curtains gently, I whispered into the stillness that I am grateful for all of it, the chaos, the quiet, the change, the memories, and even the ache, because each one has shaped me into who I am now, a mother who carries her children in her heart, no matter how far they roam. And as the light faded, I felt a calm settle in the space around me, a calm that told me I did not need to cling to the past in fear of losing it, because the past lives within me, steady and warm, reminding me that love has never left this house. It has simply taken a new form that travels with them wherever they go. As the evening settled in and the house grew quieter than I wished it would, I found myself wandering from room to room the way someone does when they are searching for something they cannot fully name. And I paused in the hallway, where the photographs of my children still hang, each one framed with the same care I felt the day the pictures were taken. And as I studied their younger faces, I felt a warm ache stretching through my chest, the same ache that has lived inside me for years, the kind that comes from loving someone so deeply that even time cannot soften the pull. And I traced one finger over the glass of a picture where they stood together, squinting in the sunlight as they tried not to laugh. And it struck me how unaware they were of how rare and beautiful those simple moments were. Because children never know that the ordinary days are the ones they will miss the most. And I stepped back slightly, allowing myself to breathe in the quiet energy of the hallway before continuing toward the kitchen, where the scent of last night's meal still lingered in a soft and familiar way, reminding me once again of how full the house feels when my children are here, and how strangely hollow it becomes when they leave. And as I cleaned the dishes slowly, letting the warm water run over my hands, I felt the weight of memory settling gently inside me, not as something heavy, but as something grounding, something that keeps me connected to the life I have lived, even as it continues to change. And I realized how important it is for me to honor these moments rather than rush through them, because the truth is that the quiet of this house is not a sign of loss, but a reminder of the seasons of motherhood, each one shaped by its own kind of love. And while I dried the last plate and set it back in its place, I found myself thinking about the ways my children have grown, the ways their personalities have evolved and stretched and strengthened over the years. And I wondered if they know how clearly I can still see the children they once were underneath the adults they have become, because that is the strange gift of a mother's heart, the ability to hold every version of your child at once, the toddler with sticky hands, the teenager with uncertain eyes, the adult trying so hard to appear steady, even when life feels unsteady under their feet. And as I turned off the kitchen light, the room sinking into a gentle dusk, I walked to the living room and settled into the same chair where I have sat for countless evenings. And I allowed myself to reflect on something I have only recently begun to understand: that the loneliness I sometimes feel is not a punishment, but a transition, a shift from constant caretaking to quiet observation. And although this stage comes with its own kind of emptiness, it also carries a surprising beauty, because it teaches me to appreciate the stillness, to listen to the soft sounds of the house settling, to embrace the space that once overwhelmed me. And this awareness brings me a kind of peace I did not expect, a peace that reminds me that life continues to offer meaning, even when the days become quieter. And as I leaned back into the chair, feeling the fabric soften under me, I thought about the moments my children sat in this very spot, telling me stories about school and friends and dreams they were afraid to speak too loudly. And I remembered the glow in their eyes when they talked about the future, as if the world were a place that would always open its doors for them. And even though life has tested them in ways none of us could have predicted, I still see that glow sometimes when they smile without thinking. And it reminds me that they carry strength within them. Strength I hope they learned, at least in part, from me. And the thought made me feel both proud and humbled, because motherhood is never a perfect art. It is 1,000 small choices and countless quiet prayers that your children will become the kind of adults who know how to love, how to forgive, how to return home when they need it. And while I closed my eyes for a moment, letting memories drift in and out like soft waves, I understood that my role now is not to guide them every day the way I once did, but to offer a place of steady warmth whenever their lives feel too cold or too fast. And that realization filled me with a calm acceptance that spread through me like a gentle tide. And as I opened my eyes again, noticing how the shadows stretched slowly across the room, I whispered to myself that love does not diminish with distance. It expands, it deepens, it finds new ways to exist. And this truth carried me into the night with a sense of quiet strength, reminding me that the story of my family is still unfolding, shaped not just by the years we live together, but also by the years we spend learning to stay connected, even when life pulls us apart. As the night deepened and the quiet wrapped itself around the house like a soft blanket, I moved to the back porch, where the air felt cooler and the sky stretched above me in a deep calm that seemed to breathe with its own steady rhythm. And I settled into the old wooden chair that has supported me through so many seasons of my life, feeling the wood press gently against my back, as if it understood the weight I carried inside me. And I let my gaze travel across the yard, where the faint outlines of the trees swayed slowly, as if whispering secrets to the wind. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me, a gentle awareness that I often try to ignore, the awareness that life has become quieter than I ever imagined it would. And yet, in that quiet, there is a strange kind of fullness that I am only now learning to understand. And as I rested my hands on the armrests, I thought about how motherhood once filled every second of my life, how there were days when I barely had time to breathe because someone always needed something. Someone always called my name. Someone always depended on me to guide them through the small and overwhelming challenges of growing up. And back then, I used to wish for a moment of calm, a single hour when I could think my own thoughts without interruption. But now that the calm has arrived in abundance, I sometimes feel overwhelmed not by noise, but by the absence of it. And while I sat there watching the shadows stretch across the yard, I found myself whispering the truth I rarely speak aloud: that I missed the version of myself who was constantly busy, constantly tired, constantly pulled in every direction, because she always knew her purpose, and she always knew that her presence mattered. And even though I am still needed, the shape of that need is different now, softer, less urgent. And sometimes I struggle to understand how to adjust to that change. And as I let that thought settle, I felt a slight tremble in my chest, not from fear, but from the recognition that this stage of life requires a different kind of strength, the kind that comes from holding space rather than filling it, from offering support without insisting on being involved, from loving deeply without expecting anything in return. And I wondered if my children know how often I think about them, not with worry the way I once did, but with a quiet longing, a longing to hear their voices without checking the clock, a longing to have them sit beside me for no reason at all, a longing to be part of their lives in ways that adulthood no longer allows. And while these thoughts moved through me like a slow current, I reminded myself that love is not measured by how often I see them, but by the connection that remains even when we are apart. And I breathed in gently, letting the night air calm the ache that had risen inside me. And then, my mind drifted to the birthdays we shared over the years, how each celebration changed as they grew older, how the small, candlelit gatherings slowly turned into quick visits or phone calls, squeezed between responsibilities. And even though those changes sometimes left me feeling unnoticed, I never allowed bitterness to take root, because I knew that growing older brings its own challenges for them, challenges they do not always talk about, challenges that shape their choices and limit their time. And I realized that part of being a mother at my age is accepting that love evolves, that closeness does not always look the way it once did, and that what matters more than the frequency of their visits is the sincerity of their hearts when they come home. And as I leaned back in the chair, I closed my eyes and let the breeze wash over me while I pictured each of my children as they are now, strong and capable, and navigating lives that once existed only in their imagination. And I felt a deep sense of pride rise inside me. Pride not just for who they have become, but for the fact that I survived every stage of motherhood to witness these outcomes. And that realization filled me with a warmth that spread through my arms and settled into my chest like a steady flame. And I thought about how many sacrifices I made along the way. Sacrifices I never saw as burdens, but as natural parts of loving someone more than myself. And yet, now that I look back, I realize how much of my identity was shaped by those choices. How many parts of me changed in ways I never noticed because I was too busy trying to be everything they needed. And while there is no regret in that truth, there is a quiet curiosity about who I am now, who I am without the constant demands of motherhood, who I am in these quiet hours when the only voice I hear is my own. And as I opened my eyes again and looked at the sky, I felt a soft determination form inside me, not the kind that pushes or demands, but the kind that gently encourages, the kind that whispers that it is time to rediscover myself in small ways, to find joy in moments that belong only to me, to embrace the freedom that once felt frightening, but now feels like a gift I never expected to receive. And in that subtle shift, I felt myself breathe more freely, as if acknowledging this truth created more space inside my heart for both my children and myself. And I sat there until the night grew cooler and the stars brightened above me, feeling the stillness settle not around me, but within me, reminding me that this stage of life, with all its quiet and all its reflection, carries its own beauty, a beauty that deepens with every memory I hold and every hope I continue to nurture. I remember the weeks that followed as a blur of movement and silence, a strange rhythm that pulled me from one emotion to the next without asking permission. And I often found myself standing in the middle of a room with no memory of why I had walked in or what I was trying to do. It was like my mind had become a house with too many doors open at once, and every breeze carried a different thought that distracted me before I could catch it. I tried to stay steady. I told myself to breathe, to focus on small tasks, to keep my feet on the ground. But there were moments when even simple things felt heavy, like holding a glass of water or choosing what to wear. I would sit on the edge of my bed, watching the morning light crawl across the floor, and wonder how something so gentle could touch me on a day when I felt so fragile inside. Sometimes I tried to hide it, even from myself, moving through the house as if I were fine. But nights betrayed me, because the stillness always revealed what I tried to bury. I lay awake, listening to the soft hums and faint echoes that filled the darkness. And somewhere between those quiet sounds, I would feel the weight of everything I had been carrying settle in my chest again. It pressed harder when I thought about how easily life can shift, how quickly a single moment can rearrange everything you thought you could count on. I kept replaying the day I walked into that ruined place, how I carried a mix of fear, determination I had never felt before, and how that single decision pulled me into a story I never expected to live. I did not know then how deeply it would change me. I did not know that it would shake loose parts of me I had ignored for years, or that it would make me question the choices I had tucked away under polite excuses. I felt myself peeling back layers of my life like old paper, each one revealing something tender and unfinished. I noticed how often I had spoken kindly to others but harshly to myself. I noticed how long I had gone without truly listening to what my heart was trying to say. I noticed how fearful I had been of taking up space, as if my needs were less important than everyone else's. These realizations did not come all at once. They arrived quietly, sometimes in the middle of a simple task like rinsing a cup or folding laundry. I would pause and feel a sudden flicker of understanding that left me standing still for a moment. One afternoon, I found myself staring at my reflection, not because I wanted to judge how I looked, but because I needed to see myself without the stories I had been repeating for years. I leaned closer, studying the small lines around my eyes, the curve of my mouth, the softness in my gaze that I had ignored for too long. I saw a woman who had spent her life carrying responsibilities that no one ever asked her to carry. I saw someone who had been brave in quiet ways, the kind of bravery that never gets applause but still holds a life together. That realization softened something inside me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a gentle swell of compassion for the woman staring back at me. I whispered that I was trying, that I was learning, and even though the words sounded fragile, they felt real. In the days that followed, I started taking slower steps. I let myself notice small details I had been rushing past: the texture of warm fabric when I pulled clothes from the dryer, the faint scent of soap on my hands after washing dishes, the way evening light shifted to a muted gold that wrapped around the walls like a quiet embrace. These little observations kept me grounded, reminding me that healing does not arrive in grand declarations, but in tiny moments when you choose to stay present. I also started having conversations with myself that I used to avoid. I asked why I always apologized before speaking, why I hesitated before setting boundaries, why I believed I needed to earn rest. The answers were layered and complicated, shaped by years of habit and fear, but facing them felt strangely freeing. It was like opening windows in a room that had been closed for too long. Fresh air does not fix everything, but it makes breathing easier. One evening, I sat outside wrapped in a blanket, letting the cool air brush against my skin. The sky stretched wide and deep, scattered with stars that shimmered like tiny promises. I closed my eyes and tried to listen to my heartbeat, steady and patient, a quiet reminder that I was still here. I thought about all the versions of me I had outgrown: the younger woman who believed she had to keep everything perfect, the middle-aged version who felt guilty for wanting more, the woman I had been just a few months earlier, who walked into that abandoned place without understanding why she couldn't turn away. Each version had shaped me, but none of them defined who I was becoming. I felt a new determination forming inside me, not loud or forceful, but steady. I knew I could not go back to who I was before, because something inside me had shifted too deeply. I also knew that the changes ahead would not be easy, but they felt necessary. There is a moment in every transformation when you realize you are no longer fighting the world. You are fighting your own resistance to becoming who you truly are. That realization softened me even more. It made me want to be gentler with myself, to honor the progress I had made even if it did not look dramatic from the outside. As I sat there, watching the night settle around me, I felt a strange calm unfold in my chest. It was not certainty, It was not confidence. It was simply the quiet understanding that I was allowed to grow. I wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders and breathed slowly, letting the cool air fill the space inside me where fear had lived for so long. Something in me whispered that this was not the end of my journey, but the beginning of a deeper one, and I believed it. I woke the next morning with a heaviness that felt familiar, the kind that settles in your chest before your eyes are even fully open. And for a moment I lay still, listening to the soft hum of the room, as if those quiet sounds could anchor me. The air felt cool against my skin, and I watched the faint line of light slip through the curtains, stretching slowly across the floor like it was trying to remind me that time was moving, even if I did not feel ready to move with it. I sat up and closed my eyes, letting my breath settle into a slow pattern that kept me from slipping back into that place of doubt where I often found myself. I kept telling myself I was doing the best I could, but some mornings the weight of old memories pressed harder than usual. I could hear the echo of my own thoughts repeating questions I wished I did not ask anymore. Why did it take me so long to step into my own life? Why did I let fear convince me that staying quiet was safer than wanting more? These questions had no simple answers, and I knew that digging for them was painful, but I also knew I could not grow without facing them. As I moved through the house, I felt the familiar pull of routine, the small actions that brought order to the chaos inside me. I opened windows to let in the morning air, and it carried a softness that brushed against my arms, as if urging me to notice something new. I made coffee and held the warm cup between my hands longer than necessary, letting the heat settle into my palm. There was something grounding in these tiny rituals, something that reminded me I was still here, even on days when I felt unsteady. I walked through each room slowly, noticing things I had overlooked for too long. A small crack along the edge of a picture frame, a layer of dust on a shelf I kept promising myself I would clean, a single sock tucked behind a chair like it had tried to escape from the laundry basket. These small imperfections made the house feel lived in, and maybe that was what I needed to see. Life was not meant to be polished and perfect. It was meant to be real, marked by moments of wear and warmth. Later in the day, I sat down at the table with the intention of writing out what I had been feeling, but the words came slowly. I looked out the window and watched leaves sway gently in the breeze, their movements soft and unhurried, and for a moment, I wished I could move through my emotions with that same ease. I wanted to let things flow through me instead of clinging to every feeling until it became too heavy to carry. I rested my hand on the table and felt the cool surface steady me. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who measured her worth by how well she held everything together, and I felt a quiet ache for her. She tried so hard. She gave so much. She believed that strength meant silence, that sacrifice was the only way to be needed. I no longer wanted to live that way. I wanted to honor the parts of me that had been ignored, the soft places I had kept hidden because I thought they made me weak. I was learning now that softness can be its own kind of strength. In the afternoon, I stepped outside to feel the sunlight on my face. The air felt warmer than it had earlier, and I stood still, letting it wrap around me like a gentle reminder that seasons were always changing, whether I noticed or not. I closed my eyes and lifted my face toward the sky, letting a deep breath fill my lungs. I could almost feel something shift inside me, a slight loosening, as if the tension I had been holding for days had finally begun to release. I walked along the path behind the house, listening to the sound of my footsteps against the ground. There was something calming about the steady rhythm, and it reminded me that movement does not have to be fast to matter. Sometimes the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other is enough. I let my fingers brush against the tall grass as I walked, feeling each blade bend gently under my touch. I noticed the way the light filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows on the ground that moved with the breeze. These little details made me feel connected to something larger, something steady and patient. When I returned inside, the house felt different. Maybe it was me who felt different, but the air seemed lighter. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down in the living room, letting my body sink into the cushion. I rested my head back and took another long breath, feeling a sense of clarity I had not felt in days. I realized then that healing does not come as a sudden wave, but as small shifts that accumulate until you finally notice you are not standing in the same place anymore. As the evening settled in, I turned on a small lamp and watched its warm glow fill the room. It cast a gentle light across the walls, and I felt a quiet comfort in that simple brightness. I pulled a blanket over my legs and let my thoughts drift to the parts of my life I had been avoiding. I thought about the expectations I had carried for years, expectations that were never truly mine, but felt heavy enough to shape the choices I made. I thought about the dreams I had pushed aside, believing they belonged to someone younger or braver. Now I wondered what would happen if I allowed myself to revisit them, not with urgency, but with curiosity. I felt a small flicker of hope, steady and warm in the center of my chest. It was not loud, but it was real. It reminded me that even after long periods of uncertainty, there can be moments when the future feels open again. I sat with that feeling for a long time, letting it settle into me like a gentle truth I had been waiting to hear. Before bed, I walked from room to room, turning off the lights, and each switch brought a soft darkness that felt peaceful rather than empty. When I finally climbed into bed, I pulled the blankets close and listened to the quiet sounds of the night. My breathing slowed, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I could rest without fighting my own thoughts. As I closed my eyes, I felt a quiet understanding slip through me. Growth does not erase the past. It simply teaches you how to carry it differently. And in that moment, I felt ready. Not for everything, but for the next small step. And that was enough. I woke the next morning with a mixture of calm and uncertainty settling inside me, like two quiet guests who arrived before I was ready to entertain them. And for a long moment, I lay still, trying to understand which feeling was stronger. The room was still dim with early light, and the air carried that faint chill that always made me pull the blankets tighter around my shoulders. I could hear the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, and the gentle hum of the heater as it turned on, and those familiar sounds reminded me that life keeps moving, even when my heart feels hesitant. I turned slowly onto my back and stared at the ceiling, noticing a small shadow in the corner where the light did not reach. It struck me how often our emotions are like that shadow, tucked into places we rarely look, waiting for us to pause long enough to see them clearly. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe through the tightness that had gathered in my chest, and as the air entered and left my lungs, I felt the first shift of the day, small but real. When I finally got out of bed, my feet pressed against the warm rug on the floor, and that simple comfort helped pull my thoughts out of the fog. I moved through the hallway with slow steps, touching the wall lightly, as if to anchor myself in the present moment. The kitchen felt welcoming in its quiet way. I started the coffee maker and listened to the gentle bubbling that always reminded me of mornings when the house used to be filled with voices. I sometimes caught myself waiting for those echoes, even though I knew they existed only in memory now. I poured the coffee into my favorite mug, the one with a tiny chip along the rim, and held it close to my face, letting the warmth rise and soften the tension in my forehead. As I took the first sip, I felt a small comfort spread through me, and I allowed myself to lean into that feeling without questioning it. I walked to the window and pushed the curtain aside. The sky was covered with soft gray clouds that looked like they were gathering themselves for rain, and I watched them move slowly across the horizon. There was something soothing about the heaviness in the air, as if the world was exhaling with me. I stood there for a long moment, using the view to steady the thoughts that had been drifting through my mind since I woke. I thought about how many years I spent trying to control every detail of my life, believing that if I held things tightly enough, then nothing could fall apart. But time taught me that control is only an illusion we cling to when we are afraid of being hurt. Real strength comes from allowing life to change, even when change frightens us. I set the mug down and walked toward the living room where I had left a stack of old boxes the night before. I had planned to sort through them for months, but always found a reason to postpone it. Something about today felt different. Maybe it was the rain-filled sky, or the quiet steadiness in the air, but I felt ready to face the memories inside those boxes, even if they stirred emotions I had pushed aside for too long. I knelt on the floor and lifted the lid of the first box. The faint smell of cardboard and time rose up, and inside, I found a collection of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. My handwriting from decades ago looked strangely young, full of loops and curves that carried the spirit of a woman who believed everything in life happened with purpose. I held the stack of letters in my hands and felt a soft ache rise in my chest. These were moments from a version of myself who lived with more hope than fear, who wrote late at night under a warm lamp while dreaming of days she believed were waiting just ahead. I opened one letter and read the first few lines. The emotions came slowly at first, like hesitant waves touching the shoreline, and I let them come without turning away. I felt tenderness for my younger self, for the woman who thought she needed to have every answer before taking a step forward. I whispered a quiet apology to her for all the years I spent judging her decisions, or blaming her for the paths that felt too difficult. She did the best she could with what she knew, and in many ways, I owed her my strength. I closed the letter and rested my hand on the box for a moment, letting the memories settle inside me. I moved on to the next box and found old photographs wrapped in thin paper. As I lifted each photo, I felt warmth fill my chest. I saw faces that once shaped my days, moments frozen in expressions that still held traces of laughter and tenderness. I felt the familiar tug of nostalgia pull at me, but this time it felt gentler, like a reminder rather than a wound. I traced the edges of one photo with my thumb, feeling the worn surface of the paper against my skin. I remembered the day it was taken, the sunlight, the scent of grass, and the sound of voices drifting through the air. That memory lived inside me, not with sadness, but with gratitude. These moments no longer felt like lost pieces of my past. They felt like small treasures I had carried with me without realizing their weight. I set the photos aside and leaned back against the couch, letting my head rest as I breathed slowly through the emotions that had risen. I realized then how often we underestimate our own resilience. We think we are breaking when we are actually reshaping ourselves, learning to hold tenderness and strength at the same time. As the afternoon light dimmed, I stood up and stretched my arms overhead. My body felt lighter, as if something inside me had finally shifted into place. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, feeling the coolness refresh my thoughts. I looked around the house, noticing how familiar everything felt, yet how different I felt moving through it. Healing changes the way you see even the simplest things. Later in the evening, I turned on a small lamp and watched its warm glow spread across the room. The soft light brought a calmness that settled deep inside me. I sat down with a blanket and let the quiet wrap itself around me. I felt a sense of peace I had not felt in a long time. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes when you finally let yourself breathe without fear. As I closed my eyes, I let the day settle inside me. I had faced what I once avoided. I had touched memories that once frightened me, and I had discovered a strength I did not know I still carried. It was not loud or sharp. It was steady and lasting. It was mine. I woke the next morning with a softness in my chest that felt unfamiliar but comforting, as if something inside me had loosened during the night. I lay still for a moment, letting the quiet of the room settle around me, and I noticed how different the silence felt compared to the days when it used to weigh heavily on my shoulders. This silence felt peaceful. It felt earned. I opened my eyes slowly and watched the faint light stretch across the ceiling, forming gentle patterns that shifted as the sun rose. There was a calmness in the air that made me breathe a little deeper. I felt grounded in a way I had not felt in years, and for a moment, I allowed myself to simply exist without questioning why I felt this way. When I finally sat up, I let my feet rest on the warm rug and kept my hands in my lap While I tried to understand the shift happening within me, healing had been slow and uneven, like learning to walk again after forgetting how to trust my own balance. But today I felt steadier. Today I felt ready. I moved through the hallway with quiet steps, running my fingers lightly along the wall as if to greet the house that held so many pieces of my life. The air smelled faintly of the lavender candle I had burned the night before, and the scent made something in my chest relax. In the kitchen, I made coffee and listened to the familiar hum of the machine, a sound that had become part of my morning ritual. I poured the coffee into my favorite mug and held it close to my face, letting the warm steam brush against my cheeks. As I took the first sip, I closed my eyes and felt the warmth spread through me, steady and grounding. I carried the mug to the table and sat down, looking out the window at the soft light filtering through the trees. The world outside looked calm, in a way that made me feel connected to it. I watched a few leaves drift gently to the ground, and the simplicity of that movement touched me. It reminded me that beginnings often appear quiet and unremarkable, yet they carry a power we only understand later. As I sat there, I felt a tug of reflection pull at me. I thought about the years I spent pushing my own needs aside so I could hold everything together for others. I thought about the way I used to measure my worth through how much I could give. Now I was learning that giving without giving to myself had slowly hollowed me out. It took me a long time to understand that caring for others is meaningful, but caring for yourself is necessary. I took another sip of coffee and let my gaze drift toward the living room, where the boxes still sat waiting for me. Yesterday's progress had opened something inside me. I felt more ready today, not because I wanted to chase the past, but because I wanted to make peace with it. I stood up, walked over to the boxes, and knelt beside them. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock, and that steady rhythm encouraged me to take the next step. I reached for the next box and opened it slowly. Inside, I found pieces of my life that I had forgotten, but somehow missed without knowing it. There were birthday cards with handwriting that had grown shaky over the years. There were small handmade gifts my children created when they were young, the kind of things I used to place on shelves with pride. I lifted a small clay figure from the box and felt a wave of warmth wash over me. It was uneven and slightly cracked, yet holding it made me feel like I was touching a moment in time that still lived inside my heart. I remembered the look on my child's face when they handed it to me, proud and excited, waiting for my reaction. I remembered the hug that followed and the way small arms wrapped around my waist with complete trust. The memory filled my chest with a tenderness that felt both sweet and heavy. I traced the edges of the figure with my thumb and let myself feel everything it brought up. I placed it gently beside me and reached for a photo album buried underneath a stack of papers. The cover was worn and faded, but as soon as I opened it, the colors of old memories came to life. I saw my children's faces at different ages, their smiles bright and unguarded. I saw myself standing behind them, my arms wrapped around their shoulders, looking younger than I remembered feeling. There was something humbling about seeing the woman I once was, the strength in her eyes, the exhaustion she tried to hide, the fierce love she carried like a second heartbeat. I took my time flipping through each page, letting every photograph remind me of who I had been and who I had become. Somewhere between the pages, I realized something important. I had spent so much of my life believing I needed to hold everything together, but the truth was that love itself had kept us connected, even when circumstances pulled us apart. Love does not disappear simply because life becomes complicated. Love adapts. Love stretches. Love remembers. I closed the album and rested my hand on top of it, feeling a quiet certainty settle inside me. My children loved me in their own imperfect ways, just as I loved them in mine. That understanding brought me a sense of peace I had long needed. I stood and carried the album to the coffee table, placing it carefully beside the others. As I stepped back, I looked around the room and felt grateful for the life I had lived, with all its joys and wounds and moments of growth. I walked to the window again and noticed the sky had brightened. A soft golden light filled the room, warming the floor and the edges of the furniture. I let the sunlight touch my face and felt a gentle hope rise within me. It was the kind of hope that grows quietly, the kind that tells you things can be better, even if the path ahead is uncertain. As the day continued, I found myself moving through the house with more ease. I made lunch, I folded laundry, I sat on the couch and let my thoughts drift without feeling overwhelmed by them. The heaviness that used to follow me felt lighter today, as if I had finally learned how to carry it differently. In the evening, I lit the lavender candle again and watched its flame flicker softly. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat in the warm glow, feeling a sense of wholeness I had not felt in years. I realized that healing is not a final destination. It is a series of small choices, gentle acknowledgments, and brave steps. It is deciding each day to show up for yourself, even when no one else can see how hard you are trying. When I finally went to bed, I rested my head on the pillow and let my breath slow. The room felt peaceful. My heart felt steady. And as I closed my eyes, I whispered a quiet promise to myself. I would keep going. I would keep listening to the small shifts within me. I would keep choosing the kind of life that feels real, honest, and mine. I woke before the sun had fully risen, and for a moment I stayed still, letting the softness of the early morning wrap itself around me like a gentle reminder that I was allowed to begin again. The room felt cool, and the quiet carried a kind of clarity that made it easier to hear my own thoughts. I turned my head slightly on the pillow and watched the faint glow of light spreading across the wall, slow and tender, like the world waking up with careful steps. I breathed deeply and felt the air settle in my lungs, steady and calm. And as I exhaled, I sensed a small shift inside me, the kind that tells you something is changing even if you cannot name it yet. I sat up slowly, letting the blanket fall around my waist, and placed my feet on the warm rug. My body felt heavier than usual, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of everything I had uncovered in the last few days. Healing always carries its own kind of heaviness, the kind that comes from sorting through everything you once avoided. Still, there was a lightness woven through it now, soft but present, like a seed that had finally begun to open. I stood and walked toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the outside world greeting the morning. The sky glowed with quiet colors, pale gold brushing against soft blue, and for a long moment I let myself admire the gentleness of it. There was something reassuring about how the world moves at its own pace, unbothered by the rush I once lived in. I curled my fingers around the edge of the curtain and allowed myself to feel grounded in the stillness. When I made my way to the kitchen, I heard the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the floor beneath my feet. These small sounds comforted me more than I expected. I brewed my coffee and stood by the counter as the warm scent filled the air. I wrapped my hands around the mug and felt the heat seep into my palms, reminding me that comfort can come from the simplest things. I took a slow sip and leaned against the counter, letting the warmth spread through my chest in a way that made the world feel a little more manageable. As I drank, I thought about how much I had carried over the years, how often I stepped aside so others could grow, how often I stayed quiet so others could be heard. I did it willingly, but somewhere along the way, I forgot that I deserved space too. Now I was learning to reclaim that space, piece by piece, morning by morning. I finished my coffee and walked into the living room where the soft light was spilling across the floor. I stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking in the familiar lines of the furniture, the framed photographs, the quiet order of everything. For the first time in a long time, the room did not feel too big for me. It felt like it belonged to me again. I walked to the shelf where I kept the photo albums and placed my palm lightly on the spine of the one I had looked through the day before. My fingers lingered there as a gentle ache rose in my chest, but it was not painful. It felt like gratitude, mixed with longing, a blend of emotions that reminded me how deeply I had lived. I did not open the album again. I simply let my hand rest there, honoring the memories without needing to relive them in that moment. I moved to the couch and sat down, tucking one leg beneath me. I reached for a notebook I had left on the coffee table, its pages blank and waiting. I had not written for myself in years. I used to fill journals with thoughts and hopes and small dreams, but life became busy and loud, and my own voice grew quiet in the background. Now I felt a pull toward it again, gentle and steady. I opened the notebook to the first page and held the pen loosely in my hand. For a moment I hesitated, unsure where to begin, but then I let the pen move across the page without trying to control the outcome. I wrote about the boxes I had opened, the memories I had uncovered, the way healing had settled into my days like a quiet guest who refused to leave. I wrote about the things I feared and the things I hoped for. I wrote about the kind of life I wanted to create for myself moving forward, one built with intention instead of habit. The words came slowly but honestly, and I felt a softness inside me as the page filled. When I set the pen down, I felt lighter, as if the act of writing had pulled something heavy out of me and placed it gently into the world. I closed the notebook and rested my hand on top of it, letting the moment sink in. I stood and walked toward the hallway, pausing beneath the photographs of my children. Their younger faces looked back at me, bright and full of life, and I felt a familiar warmth spread through my chest. But this time, the warmth did not ache. It comforted me. I touched the frame of one photo and whispered a quiet thank you, not to them, but to the life we had lived together. I knew there were still conversations we needed to have, still bridges to mend, still moments that would test our patience and love. But I also knew we would keep trying, because love does not end simply because life becomes complicated. It bends, it stretches, and it finds its way back. I continued down the hallway and returned to the kitchen where the light had grown brighter. I washed my mug and set it on the drying rack, feeling the simple satisfaction of completing a small task. As I dried my hands, I felt a surge of determination rise within me. I wanted to keep building the version of myself that had been hiding beneath years of responsibility and quiet exhaustion. I wanted to choose my days with intention, to allow myself joy without guilt, to allow myself rest without apology. When the afternoon came, I stepped outside for a moment and felt the cool air brush against my face. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting the breeze move through my hair. I felt alive in a way I had not felt in years, steady and open, ready for what came next. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house settled into its nighttime quiet, I sat on my bed and folded my hands in my lap. The day had been simple, but it had carried a meaning I could feel deep inside me. It had shown me that healing is not loud or dramatic. It is patient. It is gentle. It grows in places we once thought were barren. As I lay down and closed my eyes, I felt a quiet confidence settle into my heart. I knew there were still pieces of my story to explore, still memories to face, still love to nurture. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to keep going, ready to trust myself, ready to live with intention, ready to choose the woman I was becoming. I felt the weight of everything I had carried rising again the moment I stepped outside that morning, as if the air itself was reminding me that healing is never a straight climb, but a slow return to myself, one breath at a time. And I remember pausing at the gate with my hand resting on the cold metal, as though it could steady me while my thoughts scattered like startled birds. I told myself to keep walking, even though a part of me wanted to turn back and curl into the familiar safety of routine, the kind that keeps you alive, but never lets you feel truly living. Yet something inside insisted that this day needed to be met with open eyes, and not the quiet fear I had worn for so long that it felt like a second skin. As I made my way down the narrow path lined with fading leaves, I heard the soft crunch under my shoes and felt my heartbeat settle a little, as if my body recognized that movement means survival, and survival means hope, even the small kind that hides behind ordinary moments. I thought about how many years I had spent behaving as if my life belonged to someone else, and how often I had silenced myself because it felt easier than admitting what I really wanted. And the thought stung me with a familiar ache that felt both old and stubborn, like a bruise that refuses to fade. When I reached the open field, I stopped and looked around, letting the wide space spread before me like an invitation I had ignored too often, and I felt a sudden wash of emotion rise through me, as if I had stepped into a memory that belonged to a younger version of myself, a girl who once believed everything was possible before life taught her to measure her steps carefully. The wind brushed against my face with a gentle insistence, and I lifted my chin to meet it, allowing the cool air to clear the tightness in my chest that I had grown too accustomed to carrying. And for a moment, it felt like the world was giving me permission to breathe in a way I had not breathed in years. I thought back to the choices that had led me to this point, the moments when I stayed silent, the moments when I stayed too long, and the moments when I walked away from something good because I was afraid of losing it. And I felt an unexpected tenderness toward the woman I had been, because she had simply done what she knew. And knowing better comes only from walking through the fire. As I began moving again, my steps grew steadier, and I felt myself inching toward a truth I had avoided naming out loud. The truth that healing is not a return to who I once was, but a slow becoming of someone I had not yet met, someone braver, someone softer, someone real. I reached a small wooden bench at the edge of the field and sat down, smoothing my palm over the worn surface, as if tracing the stories of the people who had sat here before me. And I imagined their quiet moments of reflection, their whispered hopes, their private battles that would never be spoken, yet shaped them all the same. Sitting there, I felt the sudden urge to tell myself the truth, without dressing it up or hiding behind the careful words I had spent years perfecting. So I whispered into the open air that I was tired of carrying grief like a mask, and I wanted to feel something other than the hollow numbness that had followed me for far too long. The words came out shaky at first, as though they had rusted from lack of use. But once they were spoken, they settled over me with a strange and calming heaviness, and I found myself speaking again, telling the sky how lonely I had felt even when surrounded by people, how many nights I had pretended strength when all I wanted was to stop holding everything together, and how desperately I wanted a life that felt like mine. My voice trembled, yet I kept going, letting each admission loosen the knots I had carried in my chest, and I felt an unfamiliar lightness spread through me like warm sunlight, reaching a place that had been cold for years. I leaned back and watched a single bird fly across the sky, its wings cutting through the fading afternoon light, and I wondered if freedom had always looked this simple, or if I had forgotten how to recognize it. As I sat there in the long quiet that followed, I realized how much of my life had been spent seeking approval that never brought me peace, and how rarely I had honored my own needs unless they made sense to someone else. And the thought hit me with a sharp clarity that made my eyes burn. I pressed a hand to my heart and let myself feel its steady rhythm, reminding myself that I was still here, still trying, still capable of beginning again even after all the years that had been marked by loss and uncertainty. The field around me glowed with the soft colors of evening, and every detail seemed sharper, the way the grass moved in gentle waves, the way the sky shifted from pale gold to quiet blue, and the way the stillness wrapped around me like a warm hand, guiding me toward a truth I could no longer ignore. I stood slowly, feeling my legs respond with a quiet strength, and I understood that coming here was not about finding answers, but about giving myself permission to take up space again in a world I had shrunk from for too long. As I walked back toward the path, I felt grounded in a way I had not felt in years, and I realized that healing was not waiting for the perfect moment, but choosing to show up for myself even when I felt unsteady, even when I was afraid, even when it hurt. The sky dimmed as I reached the gate again, and I paused with my hands on the metal once more, feeling a quiet gratitude settle inside me for the woman I was becoming and the life I was finally ready to claim. And I stepped through the gate, with the soft but certain understanding that this was only the beginning of my return to myself. I woke on the last morning of that long season of change with a strange mix of calm and trembling in my chest, as if my heart understood something my mind was only beginning to accept. I lay there for a moment with my hand resting over my ribs, feeling the steady rise and fall that had carried me through years of fear and quiet endurance. And I whispered a small thank you to the version of myself who never gave up, even when the world felt too heavy to hold. The light slipped gently through the curtains and touched the room with the same softness that had greeted me so many mornings before. Yet something felt different, as if the air itself was quietly shifting, hinting that I had finally reached a place inside myself that no longer trembled at the thought of moving forward. When I sat up and placed my feet on the floor, I felt a grounded steadiness in my legs, and I knew it was not strength I had achieved overnight, but the slow work of showing up for myself again and again, even on the days when I felt like I had nothing left. I walked to the mirror and paused, studying the woman looking back at me with eyes that held both the depth of everything she had survived and the quiet glow of someone who was still capable of beginning again. And I felt a warm wave of recognition as if I were finally meeting myself after years of living in shadows. My reflection looked older than the girl I remembered, but softer too, with lines carved from tears and laughter and choices, and I felt a tenderness rise within me, because every mark told a story I no longer needed to hide. I touched the edge of the glass with my fingertips and whispered that I was proud of her, and the words surprised me with their honesty, because I had spent so much of my life avoiding that simple truth. When I stepped outside, the air wrapped around me with a gentle coolness, and I felt my lungs open in a way that reminded me of standing in wide fields with nothing but open sky and endless possibilities stretching before me. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to the soft hum of morning, the rustle of leaves, the distant rhythm of life waking up, and I felt myself settle into the quiet certainty that I finally belonged to my own story. As I began walking down the familiar path, I realized how different it felt to move without the weight of fear pressing against my spine. Each step seemed to echo with a soft promise, and I felt the ground steady beneath me, as if it had been waiting for this version of me to finally arrive. Memories rose with each step, memories of the woman who used to walk this same path with heavy thoughts and tight breaths, and of the woman who once believed she had run out of chances. I wanted to reach back and tell her that she was stronger than she knew, and that her story was far from over, even on the nights when she felt invisible and forgotten. I kept walking until I reached the small clearing where I used to sit during the hardest months, the spot where I learned to breathe again, the spot where the quiet saved me long before I understood that healing begins in moments no one else sees. I sat down on the same patch of ground and let my fingers brush through the cool grass, feeling the earth press softly against my hand, as if reminding me of the countless times it had held me when I felt like falling apart. I tilted my head back and looked up at the sky stretching wide and patient above me, and I felt tears gather in my eyes, not from sorrow, but from a deep, overwhelming gratitude that I was still here, still learning, still becoming. I thought about the people I had loved and lost, the choices that had shaped me, and the fears that had once kept me small, and I felt a quiet acceptance wash through me, because every chapter, even the painful ones, brought me to this moment of clarity. I remembered the nights when loneliness felt like a living thing pressing against my chest, and the days when I could not imagine feeling light again. And I wanted to wrap my arms around that version of myself and tell her she was never as alone as she believed. As I sat there, I felt the wind lift my hair and brush my cheek with a tenderness that made me close my eyes. It reminded me that life had a way of returning to us when we least expected it, not with grand gestures, but with small, steady signs that whispered, "Keep going." I placed a hand on my heart and felt its steady rhythm. And for the first time in a long time, I felt fully present, as if my mind, body, and spirit had finally caught up with one another. I whispered to myself that I forgave the woman I had been, and loved the woman I was becoming. And the words settled into me like warm sunlight. When I stood again, I felt taller, not in height, but in presence, as if something inside me had finally clicked into place. I began walking back toward home, letting the path curve beneath my feet with an easy familiarity. Yet everything around me looked different, brighter, clearer, more alive because I was seeing it with eyes no longer clouded by fear. I realized that healing had never been about returning to who I once was, but about meeting myself in each new moment with honesty and grace and courage. As I reached the gate, I paused with my hand resting on the cool metal and looked back at the path behind me, stretching into the soft light. I felt no regret, only gratitude for the journey that had carried me from grief to strength, from silence to truth, from surviving to living. I stepped through the gate with a steady breath, knowing that I was walking into a future I had created with every choice to keep going, even when it hurt. And as the door closed softly behind me, I felt a quiet certainty settle into my bones. I was finally home, within myself, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more people can find a little warmth and hope in these stories too.